Hey guys, Matt here. Been thinking about doing this one for a few days, and I guess, um, if some of you aren't already beginning to think I'm a tiny bit crazy, some of you might leave this thinking I'm totally crazy. But this talk is about stones, okay? Um, you're not going to get any sort of geology or material science or crystallography or anything like that. If you want a scientific investigation into stones, then this isn't the place to have it. But there's a remarkable number of things to say about stones, and I think I've got a sort of mixture of sort of poetic. I just had a moth just land on my shoulder. Strange, maybe trying to become my familiar or something. Um, there's a kind of poetic outlook on stones, right? So when I was wandering down the beach the other day, this was sort of around the sort of Taylor Swift debate, which I've talked about as well elsewhere. I was just kind of, when I was supposed to be seeing my girls, but they were absent for various reasons, I was wandering down the beach and I was just kind of pondering stones, right? And sort of looking at the stones and gathered a few. There's some really beautiful little smooth black ones, which I started collecting for some reason, and some oddly shaped ones, right? And I was just kind of wandering down the beach and I sort of picked a couple of these smooth black ones and I had one in each hand. And I was kind of thinking like from the point of view of the stone, right? I mean, just bear with me, right? Just assume for sake of argument that those stones have some kind of self-awareness, right? And there is a possibility of this, right? And I will explain why soon, okay? But let's just assume that they have some kind of awareness of what's going on around them. So for those stones, for millions of years, they may have been sort of tossed around in the ocean, and they've just found themselves randomly lying on this particular beach at this particular point in time and space where I arrive, right? And then I pick this stone up, and that might be the first encounter that stone has ever had with kind of like a warm-blooded, kind of animated sort of mammal, or animal of some sort. And it might feel the warmth or sort of sense a temperature change or something like that. And then I was sort of walking along and it was possibly thinking perhaps it was happy that it had finally been found and taken into care and possibly painted or celebrated in some way. And then I'm thinking about diamonds in, display cases and things like that, and then horror struck when I actually dropped the one in my right hand. Okay. And I quickly looked down on the ground, and I sort of felt like I was beginning to bond with this stone, and just in a kind of fantasy mindset. I told you I'm slightly mad, and I was horrified that I dropped it, and then I found it, but sort of picked it up. But then I thought, in the back of my mind, I thought, is that really the same one? And I had a quick look at it, and I'm pretty sure there were some markings on there. So this stone that had been tossed around for millions of years and finally found love, then just gets dropped and replaced with another lookalike. And I thought, this is where I got thinking about the I think, relatively long list of similarities between us and stones, right? So the first thing to say is that, the stone has no choice in becoming the stone, right? It just becomes that object after sort of, coagulations of various chunks of matter kind of grouping and bouncing around and smoothing and so on and so forth. So it has no choice over the way in which it is constituted, right? And that's true for us as well, isn't it? We don't even really understand what matter is, let alone, where all this stuff comes from, how life was formed. We don't really understand the true nature of things that are going on, right? So, we're similar to a stone in that sense, right? So then also think, well, the stone has no choice over where it ends up, right? Similarly, the human being has no choice over where it is born. Right, so we're literally just sort of tossed into the beach of life, if you like, just as the stone is tossed onto a particular shoreline. Okay. They also, you look at the stones on the beach, they have literally no say over which stones they're among, in the same way that humans have very little say over which humans they're born amongst, right? And then even to the extent, even when we've made choices, let's go to university, you have no control whatsoever over the people that find themselves there. Much as the beach finds itself with a bunch of random stones that could have been on any beach on Earth, but they're on this one, right? So, there's this sense of helplessness that both the stones and human beings seem to sort of share, especially with all these, fairly pressing, difficult questions around free will from Sapolsky and, obviously the retorts from various philosophers and so on. It's tricky territory, just how much control do we really have? Now, look, I'm not daft. I mean, obviously there are a ton of differences between us and the stone, right? There's certain materials, obviously we're fleshy, they're not, right? But fundamentally we're kind of still made of the same stuff. And if we believe the physicists, then it's a bunch of positively, negatively charged particles, electrons, and so on and so forth, all kind of held together by these electromagnetic fields and whatnot, right? So, you know, but we're obviously not stones. We can walk about, we can make decisions, we can intervene. The stone just seems to be tossed around, unwittingly, really. But let's just think this through. I mean, what exactly is a stone, right? This reminds me of the conversation with Karl Friston, where he was saying, look, physics is all well and good, and we can describe these dynamics of these observable phenomena, but without some proper theory of what things are, what objects are, physics doesn't really know exactly what it is that it's describing. So without a properly defined object, you can't have a properly defined dynamics of those objects. I think the argument is. So you get into the business of trying to understand indeed what an object is, right? And this is where you get into the sort of territory of thinking about persisting forms, right? And, a form that sort of maintains itself in some sense. So if you think about an animal, that's called homeostasis, where it keeps certain physical, and obviously in the case of advanced animals, or psychological parameters within certain boundaries. So, obvious stuff would be things like heat, pressure, perhaps, certainly if you're swimming around the ocean, if you go too deep, you might pop or something, So there's this kind of tendency of living things, certainly, to try to maintain certain, variables, right, within their system. I mean, if you stop eating, you die, right? And so you might say, well, but that's living things, right? So, if you take something like a table, right? That doesn't eat anything. It doesn't consume anything. But at the same time, it does sustain itself. It maintains its form. And Karl Friston talks about these things, pullback attractors. And, whatever that is metaphysically, we can set aside for one moment and just say that it is that thing which allows that object to persist through time. Okay? So, that's something else that we share with the stone. We have one of these pullback attractors, right? I think it was also suggested that this stone has some kind of a world model as well. And that is the thing, the boundary, if you like, that allows it to be distinguished from the world. But it doesn't have a self model, right? So there's, apparently, so there's nothing internal to the stone which is sort of managing that, perhaps. But it does have a pullback attractor, I think. I'm not sure about this stuff. But then this brings me into some other territory pertaining to stones, which, I actually discussed with Donald Hoffman, where he laid out this mad suggestion. Obviously he's the interface theorist of perception, right? And also, conscious agents and all that sort of stuff. So he's essentially an idealist, really. He's a scientific idealist looking for a mathematization of consciousness and suggesting that it's fundamental. And so one of the things he says is that all of the stuff, the contents of our experience, they are not really in some sort of spatio-temporal domain, like sort of space-time. They are actually representations of other conscious agencies and experiences, right? So it may be the case with these stones that, in fact, the stone actually is capable of a hell of a lot more stuff than we're aware of, but because of the limits of our perceptual sort of headset, is the language that Don uses, we can't see it, right? Because the argument is, and this has all been mathematically demonstrated with evolutionary game theory, is that the likelihood of an entity receiving any true information about the world in which it finds itself is zero. It's a probability of zero, right? According to his maths, and it's to do with these what are they called? Payoff functions, right? So essentially the argument is that there is literally no use in delivering the truth to that agent, because it doesn't help it survive, right? So you end up having all of these kind of untruthful representations of the world being reinforced because they help you survive. So for example, being able to understand that a saber-toothed tiger is likely to kill you, stuff like that is going to be reinforced, but you don't see the truth of the saber-toothed tiger. That's like a desktop icon, in the same way you don't see the truth of the email system, because you'd never get an email sent, right? You see a little icon that says email on it, right? And you click that and it opens up the system. But you don't ever see the truth of what's going on with the, the electronics and gates and all this kind of stuff. So, he's suggesting that, stones might have a load of functionality that we just can't detect because it's of no use to our survival prospects, right? And that makes so much sense to me, right? So what we're looking at, I mean, I mean, I used to be, as I've mentioned elsewhere, a sort of atheist materialist and sort of just closed the door, brought up the drawbridge against anything woo, right? So stone healing, crystal healing, all this kind of stuff was totally in the bin. But now I'm looking at it thinking, well, maybe. Right? Well, why not? If it's the case that there's probably a hell of a lot more going on with these little pebbles on the beach than we realise, then perhaps we should try to kind of freaking meditate around them or hold them, commune with them in some way. I don't bloody know. Because there could be something interesting going on about us that they can. I mean, do they have a version of us that's erroneous as well? And is it ever possible to bridge these kind of sort of interface constraints across different conscious agencies? So mad stuff, right? So what else have we got to say about stones? So they are things. They persist through time. They're beautiful to the eye. I mean, it's interesting that there's certain things in nature that are beautiful to us, and there seems to be some rationale for that, for their survival perhaps, or for some symbiotic, mutually beneficial arrangement. So the flowers would probably possibly appear attractive to bees and so on and so forth. So, but then you sort of look at stones and think, well, we can't eat them, right? So why would certain stones appear to be beautiful to us? Perhaps there's some sort of underlying advantage with having these stones nearby. So maybe these crystal people are onto something. I mean, I don't think that they've got it's not a scientific thing they've got going here, and I don't think it can be perhaps because of these interface constraints. And perhaps this is where, again, we start talking about NDEs, psychedelics, meditation, ways of disentangling the ego from the pure consciousness. So it's not directed towards problem solving and so on and so forth. It's just kind of just there, right? And I wonder if that's the sort of shortcut, if you like, around these headsets to actually make connection directly with other, more sort of exotic conscious agencies. I mean, people that can communicate, the sort of clairvoyance, people that communicate with the spirit world and so on and so forth. Maybe that's what they're doing. They're kind of tuning in to some next layer of conscious agency. I mean, we've discussed this with Mike Levin. He was, he runs his own laboratory. He's a world famous biologist. Yeah. And here's a guy saying, well, we just have to test for it. We can't make any assumptions one way or the other. Of course, there's this other thing as well. So I did a couple of talks entitled Everything is Alive, parts 1 and 2. I strongly recommend them, actually. Because I'm looking for feedback and I'm looking for criticism. Because, that's why sometimes I put forward these kind of wacky ideas. But in those talks, I suggest that actually everything that can be seen or experienced is in fact involved in life, right? For many moons, we seem to have this, or we've had this idea that there's a distinction. I mean, first and foremost, between mankind and everything else, like we're some elevated supreme being, different from the cows and bees and butterflies and so on, which more and more being shown is not the case, right? There is a continuum, right? And then of course we say, well, hang on, life is much different to non-life, right? So that introduces this kind of scientific philosophical problem called abiogenesis, right? So how do you get from so non-life, genesis to life? So how do you get from non-life to life? Well, I'm suggesting that there's just never been any such thing as non-life, right? And I'm not going to go down I'm still leaning towards idealism as the most compelling metaphysical description, and that would fit perfectly well with the idea that everything is alive, because I would, you can just skip on to then say, well, everything is conscious, and all of these living things, or the appearance of these living things, are other conscious agencies, and that's how they manifest to us across a dissociated boundary. So there you have it. I mean, who would have thought that stones, without all the fancy pants science and crystal healing stuff, could still be interesting from a kind of scientific and philosophical point of view, right? or just as a kind of metaphor for discussing things like things, right? I suppose it might just be worth saying, I mentioned this guy a few times elsewhere, Alfred North Whitehead. He kind of turned some of this sort of thing stuff on its head in a way by saying, well, actually, there are no things, there are only processes. So he's called a process philosopher. I'd strongly recommend his work, but with help as well, because it's extremely dense and off-putting. I think I remember the first page. I just thought, I just can't I can't read this. But there's actually a really cool guy called Matt Segal, I think it's pronounced, who is basically an Alfred North Whitehead. I would just heavily recommend seeking out Matt Segal, A.N. Whitehead. I mean, Whitehead's also interesting because he worked with Russell. I think they worked together on some maths and things like that as well. So he's a brilliant thinker. And but yeah, he talks about this idea of these kind of almost sort of ghostly processes that pull materials into them. And so, we're kind of paradigm shifting away from this idea that, we used to think of things as, materials first. The materials are there and then materials then do things according to the laws of physics. Well, this other way kind of suggests, well, no, there are these kind of propensities that pre-exist materials, right? And the materials are almost just the physicalists would say, well, they're gathered into some process which is caused by materials in the first place, they would suggest. But then my question would be, well, where was the first cause? And you get into these kind of strange theological dead ends and so on. So anyway, so that's stones. That's a hell of a lot more time on stones than I thought I was going to give it, but I hope it's of interest. And there's obviously some possible further reading here. There's Karl Friston, Hoffman, and so on. And obviously, again, curious to hear any more views. Hope you enjoy. Speak soon. Bye. What?